All right, so we're back. And, everyone's been watching the Israel-Palestine situation.
Yeah,
And things are really starting to heat up in the West Bank.
absolutely.
That ceasefire in Gaza.
Yeah.
Well, now Israel is launching this new operation.
Right.
They're calling it Iron Wall in Jenin.
Yeah.
And we are diving into a whole bunch of sources today to try to get the full picture.
Mm-hmm.
We've got The Guardian, New York Times, Al Jazeera,
Wow.
even Huffington Post Italia,
Interesting.
trying to get, all the angles.
Yeah, it's like each article is kind of like a piece of a puzzle,
Right.
and we're putting it all together to see, what image comes out of this.
Yeah.
What I find really interesting is how differently each source kind of frames this iron wall operation.
Yeah.
It kind of reflects, I think, the very deeply ingrained narratives on each side.
Oh, absolutely.
For sure.
For sure.
Um,
So, okay, let's start piecing this puzzle together.
okay.
Can you walk us through, exactly what's happening on the ground right now?
Sure. So Iron Wall is basically this large-scale military operation
Right.
that the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, have launched in Jenin, which is a city in the occupied West Bank.
Okay.
And we're talking like full-on offensive here.
Oh, wow.
Troops, special forces, agents from Shin Bet.
Now, when you say Shin Bet,
Yeah.
remind me who they are again.
That's Israel's internal security service.
Okay.
Kind of like their FBI.
Gotcha.
And even drone strikes targeting infrastructure.
Wow. So it's a serious, serious operation.
It is.
Yeah. And, from what I've read, the situation for Palestinians in Jenin
Yeah.
sounds
Yeah.
incredibly intense right now.
It's pretty intense.
Yeah.
The Palestinian Health Ministry is reporting at least 6 deaths and 35 injuries.
Oh, wow.
And these numbers are literally from the first few hours of the operation.
Yeah, I was going to say that's just the initial, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some sources are describing like tanks rolling through the streets, heavy airstrikes, checkpoints that make it near impossible for residents to even move around.
It's like their entire lives are getting upended
Exactly.
in a matter of hours.
It paints a very stark picture of life under this kind of constant threat,
Yeah.
you know.
And this is such a contrast to what we saw
Yeah.
just days ago, images of Hamas
Right.
holding these victory parades in Gaza after that ceasefire.
Right.
Like, what do you make of this shift in focus from Gaza to the West Bank?
Well, it raises a lot of really important questions. I
Yeah.
mean, while Hamas might be celebrating in Gaza, analysts are suggesting that they're also simultaneously shifting gears
Oh,
and arming militants in the West Bank.
So they're kind of playing both sides.
Yeah, potentially.
Wow.
This could potentially open up a whole new front against Israel.
Right. So even though they're having this victory parade,
Yeah.
they're still thinking about the next steps.
Yeah, and thinking strategically,
And Netanyahu is definitely not shying away from connecting this to the bigger regional picture. He's specifically framing Iron Wall as this effort to target what he calls the Iranian axis,
Right.
which is, essentially this idea that Iran is supplying weapons to these militants in the West Bank.
Yeah, he's trying to tie this very local conflict into this broader struggle against Iranian influence in the region.
Right. So he's bringing Iran into this.
Exactly.
But, if we kind of zoom back in on the West Bank,
Yeah,
we need to also consider the Palestinian Authority's perspective on all of this.
absolutely.
Because they were actually in the middle of their own security operation in Jenin
Right.
before the IDF launched Iron Wall.
Right.
They were trying to dismantle militant groups and assert control.
Exactly. They're trying to,
It's like they're getting squeezed from both sides.
yeah, they're in a really tough spot
Yeah.
trying to be the responsible governing body, in the aftermath of the Gaza war. But they're facing pressure from both Israel and Hamas.
It's like they're trying to walk this.
Exactly. It's a
thin-
balancing act. Yeah.
On the one hand, they're condemning the Israeli settler violence,
Right.
calling for international intervention. But on the other hand,
They're also trying to, maintain some semblance of order and security in their own territory.
no.
And speaking of settler violence,
Yeah,
it seems like that's adding another layer of complexity
absolutely.
to the tension that's already in the West Bank.
We're seeing reports of Israeli settlers attacking Palestinian villages,
Mm-hmm.
setting vehicles and property on fire,
Wow.
even clashing with Israeli security forces.
Yeah.
It really highlights how volatile the situation on the ground is.
Yeah.
And, the fact that there are these internal disagreements, even within Israel itself,
Yeah.
about how to handle this situation.
Well, and you mentioned those disagreements, and one that I think really stands out
Yeah.
is the resignation of the Israeli military chief.
Oh, yeah, Hersey Hilly.
Yeah, he directly cited this terrible failure of security and intelligence that allowed the initial Hamas attack on Israel. And that resignation, I think, speaks volumes.
Yeah.
It reveals this deep sense of unease and criticism, even within Israel itself, about how this conflict's being handled.
So even internally, they're not unified.
No, not at all.
On how to deal with it.
And then you also have figures like Defense Minister Israel Katz, who, you know, while he's condemning the settler attacks, he's also emphasizing these growing threats to Israeli settlements.
So it's like this conflict is causing rifts, both between Israelis and Palestinians, but then also within Israeli society itself.
It's a very multi-layered conflict with these fault lines running in every direction.
Yeah, so much tension, and it's just building and building and building.
And just as this new chapter is kind of beginning in the West Bank, there's also a major shift happening in the international landscape.
Okay.
We've got the inauguration of Donald Trump as U.S. president.
And the timing of this is, I mean, it can't be a coincidence. It seems very intentional.
Yeah. It raises a lot of eyebrows for sure.
Because Trump's arrival, I mean, it signals a potential shift in U.S. policy toward the Israel-Palestine conflict.
Absolutely.
And that has, you know, major implications for what's happening in the West Bank.
Huge implications.
One of his first moves, I mean, right out of the gate.
Yeah.
He revoked the sanctions that the previous Biden administration had imposed on Israeli settlers. Who were accused of violence against Palestinians.
A pretty significant policy change right there.
Right out of the gate.
Yeah.
Right away.
And we can't forget his pick for UN Ambassador Elise Stefanik. Her assertion of Israel's biblical right to the entire West Bank.
Yeah, which Netanyahu refers to as Judea and Samaria.
Judea and Samaria.
Right.
That signals a potential shift in the U.S. stance on Israeli settlements.
Huge shift.
In occupied territory.
It could have far-reaching consequences.
Yeah.
You know, if the U.S. kind of moves away from pressuring Israel on settlements and into a position of, like, tacit approval, as some experts are suggesting.
Yeah. It could embolden these more extreme settler groups and lead to a further escalation of violence against Palestinians.
It's a lot to unpack.
Oh, yeah.
And I feel like we're just getting started here.
We're just scratching the surface.
So much is happening all at once. It's like easy to get lost in all the headlines.
Yeah, it really is.
But I mean, that's exactly why we're doing this deep dive.
Yeah.
To try to look beyond those headlines.
Yeah, to get beneath the surface.
And understand, you know, the complexities that are at play here.
It's more important now than ever.
Yeah.
Because the situation in the West Bank is incredibly fluid.
Right. It could go any which way.
It could, you know, this Iron Wall operation could be a turning point for better or for worse.
Right. And we're going to keep exploring this.
Yeah.
So stay with us as we continue to explore, you know, the potential consequences and what they mean for the future of this conflict.
Absolutely. It's just, it's crucial to remember that, like, behind all these political moves and military operations, there are real people whose lives are being, you know, profoundly affected.
Absolutely. It's so easy to get caught up in the big picture analysis. But we can't lose sight of, like, the human cost of this conflict.
There was one article I read that shared the story of this Palestinian family in Jenin.
Oh, wow.
Whose home was damaged in an airstrike during the operation. The father was describing, like, the terror of that night.
Oh, God.
The fear for his children.
I can't imagine.
And the uncertainty of what comes next, you know?
Yeah,
it's really...
It's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And it makes me think about, like, the broader humanitarian impact of Iron Wall. What are the long-term consequences for the people living in Jenin and the surrounding areas?
I mean, the sources paint this picture of disruption and displacement with limited access to basic necessities, restrictions on movement.
Like you said, their lives are just completely upended.
Exactly. Yeah. And then there's, like, the constant fear of violence.
Yeah.
Daily life just becomes this struggle for survival.
Yeah, absolutely. And then beyond just, like, the immediate impact. There's the psychological toll.
Oh, absolutely.
Of living under these conditions. I mean, the trauma.
Yeah.
The fear, the sense of hopelessness.
These are wounds that run very deep.
Yeah.
And they can have these lasting effects on individuals, families, entire communities.
It's generational trauma.
Absolutely.
It's clear that the situation in the West Bank is incredibly complex.
It really is.
I mean, you have the political shifts happening with Trump's inauguration. You have kind of the security vacuum left in the wake of the Gaza war. And now you have this Operation Iron Wall
right on top of everything else.
Yeah. It feels like all these factors are like intertwined. It could so easily escalate into something even bigger.
The potential for like a wider conflict is a real concern.
For sure.
The situation in the West Bank is so fragile right now.
Yeah.
Any misstep could have serious consequences.
So what are some of the possible scenarios here?
Yeah.
Like, what are some potential paths forward that you see?
One possible scenario is that Iron Wall actually achieves its stated objectives.
Okay.
The IDF successfully dismantles the militant infrastructure in Jenin, weakens Hamas's influence in the West Bank, and restores a sense of security for the Israeli settlements.
So that's kind of like the best case scenario in a way.
Yeah, in a way. I mean, it could potentially lead to a period of relative calm.
Right.
But it's unlikely to address the underlying issues that are fueling the conflict.
It doesn't really solve the root of the problem.
Exactly.
And that brings us to kind of like the other scenario,
right? The flip side.
Yeah, where the operation backfires.
If Iron Wall ends up resulting in a lot of Palestinian casualties, which fuels, resentment and anger, and strengthens support for Hamas, it could actually lead to like a much more violent backlash.
Oh, wow.
We could see an escalation of attacks against Israeli targets, a resurgence of militancy in the West Bank, and a further deterioration of the security situation.
So it could make things much worse.
It could make things much, much worse.
And then you have the role of the Palestinian Authority.
Right.
I mean, how do they navigate this incredibly difficult situation?
They're in a really tight spot trying to walk this tightrope between maintaining security and avoiding a confrontation with Israel, but then also trying to demonstrate their relevance and legitimacy to the Palestinian people.
It's a very precarious position to be in.
It is, and they're calling for international intervention.
Right.
But it remains to be seen how effective that'll actually be.
You mentioned international intervention, and one actor that we haven't really talked about much is the UN. What role could they play in all this?
Well, the UN has already expressed concerns about the expansion of Israeli operations in the West Bank.
Okay.
So they could potentially push for a ceasefire, provide humanitarian assistance, and maybe even try to mediate between the parties.
It seems like a tall order.
It is a tall order, and with the U.S. potentially shifting its stance under Trump, it's unclear how much leverage they would actually have.
It seems like there's a lot of uncertainty.
Oh, yeah, tons of uncertainty.
About what the future holds for the West Bank.
Yeah.
But one thing is for sure.
Yeah.
The decisions that are made in the coming days and weeks are going to have a profound impact.
Absolutely.
Not just for the region, but potentially for the world as well.
I mean, what happens in the West Bank doesn't just stay in the West Bank.
Right. It has ripple effects.
This conflict has ripple effects across the globe.
Yeah.
It impacts international relations.
Right.
It fuels political debates.
For sure.
It raises these really fundamental questions about human rights and justice.
Yeah, it really highlights how interconnected we all are.
Yeah.
And how events in one part of the world can resonate so far beyond its borders. And it really makes you think about how, so much of the coverage focuses on like the political and the military aspects of it all.
Yeah.
But it's like we lose sight of the human side.
Oh, totally. The whole conflict.
It's so essential to remember that there are real people on both sides of this conflict.
People with families, hopes, fears,
Exactly. And we have to resist this temptation to dehumanize either side.
For sure.
And instead really try to understand the human cost of this ongoing struggle.
You can't just view this conflict
through
the lens of statistics and like strategic objectives. It's about individual lives. Being disrupted, communities being torn apart, this cycle of violence that just perpetuates, trauma and suffering. I think that's a really key takeaway for anyone who's following this story. We need to engage with it on a human level.
Yeah.
Connect with the stories of the individuals who are experiencing this conflict firsthand.
Yeah.
I think it's through those stories that we can really start to grasp the true complexity of the situation and just like the urgent need for a path towards peace.
So, you've walked us through all the complexities of Operation Iron Wall, the potential consequences, the different perspectives at play here. As we kind of wrap up this deep dive, what would you say is like the most important thing?
Well, I think the most important thing to understand is just that this situation is constantly evolving.
Yeah.
Iron Wall is just one chapter in this long and complicated story.
It's not the end-all be-all.
It's crucial to stay informed, to like critically evaluate the information that we're consuming and to engage in, thoughtful conversations about a path forward.
It's like we can't just be passive consumers of headlines.
Exactly.
We have to actually like delve deeper, challenge our assumptions, seek out these diverse perspectives.
And it's not just about staying informed. It's about taking action. Even small actions can make a difference. Supporting organizations that are working to promote peace. Engaging in dialogue with people who hold different views. Amplifying the voices of those who are often marginalized. These are all ways that we can contribute to, a more peaceful future.
This deep dive has been so eye-opening.
It has.
We've unpacked the latest developments, explored different perspectives, considered all these different scenarios.
Absolutely.
But I want to leave everyone listening with a question.
Okay.
We've talked about how the focus seems to be shifting from Gaza to the West Bank. Could this be the start of something even bigger?
It's a good question.
Could the West Bank become the new epicenter?
It's possible.
Of the Israel-Palestine conflict? And if so, what role can we play in actually shaping that outcome?
I mean, that is a question worth grappling with.
Yeah.
And there are no easy answers.
No.
But I think by engaging with these questions, by staying informed, taking action, we can contribute to, a more informed and compassionate conversation about this really complex and enduring conflict.
Well, thank you so much for guiding us through this really complex topic.
Happy to do it.
It's been a real deep dive.
It has.
And to all our listeners out there, we encourage you to, continue exploring these issues.
Absolutely.
Seek out those diverse perspectives and use your voice to advocate for peace and understanding.
I think that's the most important thing.
All right. Well, thanks again for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And to everyone listening out there, remember the journey to understanding continues.